Welcome everybody to our weekly or twice a week webinar that we have on the topic of magnetism and attitudes. And basically the idea being, what are those things that will make us at this time that we find ourselves facing more magnetic? Perhaps how do we overcome those things that are going to make us less magnetic? And originally I was thinking about this week's class, and I had originally come up with the idea that I would address the topic of fear and worry. But as I began thinking about it, I didn't think that actually that's describing who we are. I think most of you that I'm talking to today probably are devotees. Many of you are Kriyabans. You're probably meditators, longtime meditators. And I think fear is a little bit strong. I think there's moments of fear when something sudden comes, but I think all of you would best be described, I think what's going on now, certainly it is for me. When I look into my own life, I don't really feel a sense of fear, and people around me, I don't see that as well, at least devotees. Now, if those of you perhaps not devotees or don't have a connection with God and our teachings, maybe you do feel fear. But what I notice is I could definitely say that there is anxiety. And so what I wanted to speak about tonight is I wanted to speak about that sense of anxiety that comes to all of us at some point or another. And I'd like to mention first that a little bit of anxiety is actually a good thing. It's nature's way of telling us, oh, did I lock my car? Oh, where did I put my keys? And you think about that. Sometimes I remember waking up in the middle of the night and there would be some unfulfilled task. I said, did I do that or not? And then I had a hard time going back to sleep, and sometimes would have to get up in the middle of the night and go look, say, I did it, or I wrote that email, or I mailed that letter. And so in a sense, it's nature's way of reminding us in that way. And I read an article a while back. It was a psychology article, and they said one of the greatest drivers, if not the greatest drivers of anxiety in people, is the quality of uncertainty. And if there's anything that describes the environment that we find ourselves in right now, it's uncertainty. We just don't know. When is this lockdown going to end? When is transportation going to be going again? What about my employment? What about my job? What about my family that's on the other side of the country? All of these uncertainties, it causes a certain stimulation within us, and we begin to ask these questions in our mind. Well, what if this? What about that? And a little bit, if you're not careful, pretty soon, you find yourself like I sometimes have in the past, waking up in the middle of the night and you're anxious and and actually even people have anxiety attacks. They get struck by, to the degree that the anxiety starts to have a feedback loop within them, that their heart begins to pound and they actually turns into a real condition. But I'm not so much speaking about that right now, but the general sense of anxiety that people have. And I think tonight's speaking about this was stimulated by questions that have been coming in. I asked people to submit questions, and a week or so ago, somebody asked a question about not themselves particularly being anxious, but they lived in a household where most people did not have a meditation practice, were not Kriyabans. And she noticed that the people in the household were very anxious, and she was wondering, what can she do to help these people, her family, I imagine. What can she do to help alleviate that anxiety? And this is something I think all of us, whether are feeling these days, whether it's in ourselves or with people around us, is this certain sense of anxiety. And of course, related to that is worry. And I guess if you magnify anxiety and worry even further, it can turn into fear. And you find people panicking, having panic attacks and doing irrational things. Because what is happening, what's going on when you have a regular environment of situations that are causing anxiety, what is happening is you're having within your own brain, you're having a war going on. That fight or flight response that's in the back of the brain or in the deep in the brain versus that prefrontal lobe part of the brain, which is able to assess a situation. The prefrontal lobes are where a sense of rationality, willpower, concentration, those qualities are located more here up front. And so you're having this conflict going on. And when you start to feel real anxious, what happens is it actually begins to pinch down that response mechanism in the front of the brain, and it begins to take over. And so you have this inner fight within each of us. I don't know if I'm not going to do it today, but you could probably say, well, yes, that's Kurukshetra right there, those two tendencies. I'm not, fight, flight, thinking it through, doing the appropriate thing are taking place within all of us at this time. And we need to be aware of this. And I think this is one of the things that if you are feeling anxious or you have people in the house feeling anxious, it's all right. This is natural. Don't think, oh, I shouldn't be feeling this way. No, that's not necessarily true. If anything, this is probably an appropriate time, but we don't want to let it get away from us. In other words, to the point of where we lose control, because that mental control to some degree is also something in the frontal part of the brain. So to be aware of something is the first step of learning to be in control of that. We always say that in yoga. Awareness precedes control. So if the fact that you notice people are being anxious, are they aware of that anxiety that's in them? Then once you have self-awareness of anxiety and others, then you can start to do something about it. I know Swami Kriyananda talked about these types of things many times in many of his lectures. And like when things start going, just a very simple example, when things start going in an anxious direction, we start thinking, well, what about this? What about that? What if this? What about that? And Swami would just say, if that's happening with you, take the initiative and say, yes, what if? What if it really did, whatever the scenario is, that what if something happened? Now, I have a little anxiety. I'll share with you. I have a little anxiety. I have a daughter who's in Mexico. She lives in Mexico. And naturally, I start thinking, oh gosh, how secure is that? And I mean, I'm sure she's perfectly fine rationally, I think about it, and that's what she tells me. But nevertheless, I mean, a father thinks about these things. I'm a little anxious. Well, then as I start thinking, I start recognizing, oh, wait a minute, I'm a little bit anxious. And then you begin to step back a little bit, and then you start playing out. Now, if you have any of these what if questions in your mind, Swami would say, why not just play it out? What if? What if the worst thing happened? How would you feel? Well, you'd feel terrible, actually. But, okay, now what? Well, then you do this or that. Okay, now what? And he would encourage you or encourage us to play out the what if scenario to its ultimate end. And ultimately, there you are, faced with a challenge, you have to do something about it. And if you face your what if questions and just play them out in your mind. Now remember, he was speaking to devotees here. Perhaps a non-devotee might lose control, but a devotee plays it out, and he would encourage us to get to that point and feeling in the heart that yes, I too, I can accept. Because God is with us. You see, this is what separates the devotee from the non-devotee, is we have an ally sitting right beside us, here behind us. We have divine help. And so we play it out to say, could I accept that? Could I accept if something really bad started to happen? And you say, no, first, but then, well, what if, what do you do then? Until you finally get to the point you say, okay, that too. And then you bring God into the equation and say, God, help me. And then help me get to that point where I can accept. And one by one, we play those out. And then you find that in your response to life, that whatever comes, Lord, I can take it. I can handle it because I have you there at my side. But remember, God, I'm making a bargain. And so, yes, maybe your human side wants to make a little bit of a bargain. It's okay. It's okay. God, the master used to say, well, God likes that because you're talking to God. The very effort to have that relationship and have that conversation is a good thing. And so, yes, you bargain. That's the human way, I guess. But at least you're bringing in that conversation. And you find that in the process of doing something, you're actually acting. Because what happens when we're anxious? It begins to pinch off, as I said, the frontal part. And what can happen is it can lead you to paralysis of action. The very act of doing something, of responding, in this case, to playing out that scenario, the very act of doing something engages your will. And this is what we've been talking about these many weeks now. Engaging the will and acting affirmatively. And just by merely doing something, whatever it is, brings your attention away from that anxiety center in the brain up into the forward part of the brain. And you begin to, it's an awareness response. Being aware of the moment takes your mind, you might say, out of that cycling loop that you get in when you pinch off the frontal parts of the brain. So you do something like that. And so these little things like this, in many ways, we can find that by being active, by taking some sort of action, we then gain a sense of control. I've known years ago, I was mentioning that example of waking up in the middle of the night and being anxious about something. I've had a problem of this or that, or it's my job, or whatever it might be. And I find that my mind would start cycling, how you're half awake and half asleep, and your mind would be going. And realizing, whoa, this is happening, I would just stop. And I would start to say, Om Guru, Om Guru. Om. And the anxiety would want to attack me and take me away from that and get my mind engaged in that. I wouldn't let it. I use my will, in other words. By the use of your will, you bring your attention away from those fear centers in the back of the brain. And I'd say, Om Guru, Om Guru. And at the same time, of course, invoking Guru's presence. But Om Guru, Om Guru. And I'd do that until, if long enough, I'd end up going back to sleep and keeping at bay that tendency of the mind, or the emotional mind, the subconscious mind, the reactive mind, to gain control over me. And that I'd be, in that way, I would do something positive. Now, another very good thing to do is, anxiety is built upon and flourishes in an environment of uncertainty, which is, like I say, which is what we're facing right now. If you can bring some certainty into your life, this too helps. So by that, what I mean is engage a routine. Have a routine in your life. Now, especially now that some of us may find ourselves totally in a different situation because of this lockdown. What do I do with myself? What do I, so maybe you find that when you're in your work environment, you were getting up at a certain time, you're having breakfast at a certain time, go to the office at a certain time. Your life was routine, and you had that routine to fall back on. This is helpful also. When sometimes you find people that have no routine, their day-to-day life starts to fall apart. They're sleeping late, they don't know what to do, and you're giving an opening in your life in order for anxiety, if you're inclined that way. You're giving it to come in. You don't want to be passive. And if you have a defined routine in your life, it helps you stay engaged. So consequently, for all those of us who are meditators, part of that routine is getting up, doing our exercises, sitting to meditate. We do it, we have breakfast, we maybe have to interject new elements into our routine, but have a structured life. And I think you'll find you're going to be less susceptible to being pulled away and engaged losing control, you might say, of your situation. Now, there's when we've been talking about the necessity to be affirmative and to be engaged and to face fear, fearful situations, worry. Oh, and that reminds me of when I mentioned the word worry. Master said, and this of course too is, and will engage you, is we go on diet fasts where we don't eat any food. He says, why don't you take a worry fast? This was, I thought, one of the nicest things he said. If you're a chronic worrier, or in this case, as we're speaking of anxiety, if you have constant anxiety, take an anxiety fast. He would say, first, say for the next minute, 2 minutes, I am absolutely not going to worry. And so you put your mind, very likely one of the best ways is not keep a blank mind, but put it on something positive for 2 minutes. Go 3, 4, 5, and so on. And Master says, slowly you build up that muscle that resists that tendency to pull you into worry. So, but now coming back to where I was going with this was being able to, we speak about fear and worry and anxiety, and we invoke that element of courage. And that's one way. It's a very positive way, and we've spoken about that already. And so I'll just mention that. We're courageous, we're going to face it, and I'm strong, I'm powerful, I'm affirmative, and I've done all of the things to build up my courage muscles. That's one way, and it's a good thing. We should do that. But there's a second way. And this is the element that I'd like to illustrate with one of my, it's a favorite story of mine, that there was once a village in Korea. And at that time, in medieval days, Korean warlords would fight one another. And at one point in history, there was a general rose up, a warlord rose up, and he rose his army up, and he began to conquer all the villages in the neighborhood in that part of Korea. He took them over, and he would go in with his army, and he would slaughter the local villagers. And the word went around in this one village that the army of this warlord was coming. And so everybody packed up and everybody fled the village off into the countryside, into the forest, except for one man who happened to be the priest of the local, temple, probably Buddhist temple, and he was there. He stayed. He was noted to be calm, noted to be centered, and he stayed. And sure enough, the warlord came in with his army, marched in, ransacked the town, and the warlord came and saw that there was this priest doing his daily rituals there in the temple. And he said, he marched in up to the warlord, the warlord marched up to the priest and said to him, "You fool, do you know who I am? I'm the man that can run you through in an instant with my sword." And he brandished it in front of the priest. And the priest was very calm. He said, "Sir, I am the man." The warlord says, "I could run you through with the sword in the blink of an eye." And the priest says, "Sir, well, I am the man who can be run through and allow you to run me through with your sword also in the blink of an eye." And he was totally calm. And the general, as the story goes, to his credit, recognized that he was standing before a remarkable man. And he gave a bow and he let him go, he went on his way. But you see, this moral here is the priest was of that temperament, and he had nothing to lose. Now, isn't anxiety based a little bit upon the fear of loss, the fear of something going wrong, the fear of things are not in this world as I want them to be, trying to keep a sense of everything like it is? But in a sense, if there is nothing to lose. There's no sense of possession of anything, material, mental, otherwise. I'm perfectly content in the moment. If I go, the man does run me through with the sword, that's okay. I'm ready at any moment, Lord. I'm yours. And I think, in a sense, for the devotee, that's something to consider. At night, you might look at all of those what if situations, coming back to that. What if that? What if that? Can I accept that? Can I deal with it? If life throws something at me, am I able to process that and march forward as a child of God? Whatever comes of itself, can I let it come and not allow it to take possession of me and do whatever is needful at that time? And I think this is something to consider. This is what we have built ourselves up to. You could say this challenge that is coming, which is very unprecedented. In the last 100 years, there's nothing like it. We have been born for this moment as devotees to be challenged and tested. This is our test. Now, sometimes people say, well, it's not mine. Why is it coming from me? Why am I finding myself? It's so unfair. It's nothing's unfair in life. This is what life has given us. It's a unprecedented opportunity for us at this moment. And so consequently, we have to use whatever tools we can. Now, we have. Now, I'm not saying to be passive or not care, but I'm saying to be able to accept from a position of strength, not from a position of weakness. Now, I have a little time left here. I want to go over some of these. But I've mentioned a few things already, but I want to add to this list, and probably I should make a handout or something that you can have if afterwards. I've got quite a few. There is a technique that is also relating to psychological studies. It's called the stop technique. If you find yourself anxiety to the point where it's actually getting a hold of you, it's called stop. And what you do is, when you recognize that your mind is starting to get away from you. Now, this can also be used for if a person has anger problems within themselves. They're getting angry. Is you recognize it, and that's the key. Because once you recognition from it comes control. And then you say stop with a great deal of power to yourself, or if nobody's around, you can say it out loud. Very firmly, stop to your mind. And then immediately take a very deep breath, or 2 or 3. And hold it, gather it. And as you exhale, you can feel yourself expelling that tension or whatever it is. And again, you can even tense and let it go. And then continue with some positive directional activity. And then do it again. If you have to do it every 5 minutes, stop. And eventually the mind will be trained to catch itself before that cycle. Now, most of us, I don't think, are having that sort of cycling, but a few people, sometimes that does happen. And if you know somebody that's having a problem with that, you might try that technique. Now, here's another point to remember. We're dealing with a contagion here, this virus, coronavirus. Well, do you know also anxiety is contagious? Very contagious. You get around an anxious person very long, and you're going to get anxious too, unless you're really on top of yourself. But it infects people around you, and you too will be infected. So watch your environment. And you want to put that shield of positivity around yourself and say, uh-oh, this is what's happening. And be aware of that, because it's an infectious disease. Now, that puts upon us a responsibility for what we express. So if you have people in your environment who are prone to being anxious or panicky, you need to be very careful of what you project, because it really does infect. And this has been shown to be the case. Many different studies, people people go out. Why do people all of a sudden, a normal crowd's going, everything's going fine, and it turns into a crowd panic? You ever been in a crowd that all of a sudden has become panicked? It's frightening. In a large crowd of people, panic suddenly strikes it, and then perhaps they start rushing this way or that way. And a little bit of that is in, if you're in the middle, you're in a tough spot. Well, it's the same thing. People all of a sudden get panicked. People panic buying, they panic, they do this, that. And as it's what's happening there, again, is this fear center in the back of the brain is starting to stimulate. And the rational part of our own self-control and thinking begins to be pinched off. So don't spread the disease. And I think we're going to be doing everybody a favor when we do that. Okay, physical exercise. Be physical. I mean, do something. Because if you're physically passive, the tendency is to devolve into mental passivity as well. And what happens when you're mentally passive? You're not using your willpower, magnetism goes down. You're not using your willpower, you get lazy and subject to the influences of your environment. And this is not what we've done to do. If you get lazy, your magnetism aura has holes in it, and we become subject to who knows what. And physically, we become subject to the coronavirus itself. Because we're not strong, we don't respond as well as we could. I think underneath all of this, of course, is the realization as a devotee, as a practitioner of yoga, that we are not this body. We're something beyond this. And so to the degree that we can keep affirming that and working from that realization, helping other people, again, this comes back to being positive and engaged rather than passive, to engage the will in some way, that whatever we can do that is engaging, that is non-passive, again, it strengthens us, keeps our magnetism high, and we find it wards off anxiety. Anyway, I was one of the other classes I was listening to, mentioned this attitude of shifting our attitude to the world at large. Because in a sense, when we have this environment with this situation, why is this happening? There's a sense of, wow, this virus is invading me. It's coming into the society. And in a sense, now this may seem a little counterintuitive, but why not have an attitude of gratefulness as well? Now, what should we be grateful for? Well, are we grateful for to the virus? Well, it's God that we're grateful. We're grateful for God giving to us at any time. If we see everything, don't we say this all the time in our teachings? Everything comes from God. And so this too is from you, God. You have sent this. And this attitude of gratefulness, it's a tremendously magnetic attitude to have. And you say, well, God, I want everything that you're my one and only love in this life, God, except don't send me that virus. That except for, and if you say, no, God, it's all your play. This is, you are sending this to me, not necessarily the virus, but the situation that we find ourselves in. You've sent this to me, and I'm grateful, Lord. And when you have gratitude, naturally, think of you give a present to somebody and they express gratitude, well, naturally, you're going to move aura-wise or thought-wise toward that person. So this is the same thing with God, to have the attitude of gratefulness to everything that comes to us in life. It's coming from God. I accept, and you are my stocks and bonds, Lord, is what our masters said it during the Depression days. You are my stocks and bonds behind all whatever goes on in the world outside of us. Live in the thought that God is with you always. Visualize yourself. Now, a couple of visual yourself in the midst of light. Here was an interesting thing. I was looking through some old notes about fear and worry, And I saw something and I thought I just mentioned it. I don't know if it has any good, but there's as you know, I go to China from time to time, and there's a Qigong exercises that they do in China. And I thought I'd just share that massaging the fingers on your hand. In Qigong in China, this is taught that the thumb is associated with worry. And so they say if you know all the different parts of your thumb. I'm not an expert on this, but you massage your thumb if you feel a sense of worry. You can just go all around that point, and it's said to be very wholesome for that. The forefinger is massage that to counteract depression, sadness, and grief. The middle finger is if you feel a sense of impatience and hastiness. The ring finger, anger. Because sometimes, you know, people, this is something maybe in a later class, I don't have time, we should talk about anger. Because here we find ourselves in a situation that's not under our control, is it? And some people get angry with that. They like to be in control. They can't deal with situations that aren't in control. And that anger starts to take expression. Ooh, we need to deal with that. So that, but I can't go into that in this class with time, but maybe in the future we'll talk about that. But anyway, coming back, that fourth finger is said to be associated with anger. And finally, the little finger is said to be associated with fear. And so besides, now I'm just throwing this out there as a little something to think about. And on top of that, though, and maybe I'll end with this one. I have quite a long list here, but our time is up. The greatest antidote to grief, greatest fear, anger, all of these negative emotions, what is the greatest antidote? I think if you think about it, you know what it is. It's love. And love, not personal so much, but love, God's love, that we are loved. You see, it's not that love is coming to us. And when you meditate, I'd like to suggest, try to feel that. We want to love God, yes, and I'm sure we try to do that. But remember, it's also, we are loved. If you only knew, St. John Vianney said, if you only knew how much God loved you, you would die for joy. And that's, I think, in our meditations, just feel that God's presence is right there. And if we are in love, in that love, it's the same thing as saying what Master said. If you're in Om, nothing can touch you. If you're in the divine light, nothing can touch you. If you're in divine peace, nothing can touch you. If you're in divine love, nothing can touch you. And so this is our challenge, and this is the true antidote for all things that we're facing now in this very critical time, is to feel those qualities, those expressions of the divine. Meditate more. This morning we had a 8-hour meditation online. I hope some of you were able to join us for that. But we have such things, and I think now is a good time to all of us to join hands together as devotees of light, devotees of joy, and to form a strong bond. Swami Kriyananda used to say, people think it takes millions and millions of people to change the world. It does not. It takes only a few. It starts with a few. He says a few people of strong conviction, a few people with true solutions to life, joining their forces together and concentrating them, they can change the world. They may not see it in their lifetime even, but that seed planted will begin to sprout and can change the world. And I think we are at one of those transformative moments in history that people will look back on this time and they'll say, yes, you remember that time? This is one of those. And what we do now is going to have a great impact on what comes in this future 21st century. So I'll pick up again next Monday night at 7:30, and we'll continue our discussion on this building magnetism in this time of trial and testing. And in between now and then, I welcome you to send questions. Your questions, I'll try to answer as time goes by. Not always immediately, but we'll get to them. And sometimes those questions are very, very good for me because they spur me on to think about things that, oh, like tonight's talk was based on somebody wrote last week. So, and so send them into online at anandaindia.org or on the chat function here on the Zoom chat function. And I'll try to get to them, and they'll be great guides for me. So much blessings to you. And it's such a joy for me to be able to share these teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda and these teachings of my teacher, Swami Priyananda, with all of you. Om, God bless you all.